Well, I want to, again, welcome all of you to our KEI, CSIS, and Council on Foreign Relations panel on Korea issues. I think this is probably the record time in which we actually did a program like this, because President Park is still in town, and we're already doing an assessment on the summit. But these last few days has truly been a historic time for the alliance, the U.S.-Korea alliance, and this is not only her first visit as this new South Korean president to the United States, but also a milestone event where the last few days will set the tone for the next, at least for the next 4 years in this bilateral alliance. I don't know if you watched this morning's joint congressional address that she gave, and she gave it in English, and she also gave in English her U.S. Chamber of Commerce presentation too, and it was truly an impressive speech, and certainly her English was even better than Speaker Boehner this morning. I don't know if you watched that. Yeah, oh no.
Cameras are rolling, so.
I did some digging around too. I think all of us are aware that her presentation at the joint session of Congress today was a really historic moment. And how historic, I did some digging around. And of course, on the House Representative website, this is actually South Korea's 6th address to a joint Congress, which surpasses Germany, which only has 5, and joins the rank of Italy and Ireland. And only 2 countries have more joint congressional addresses, which is Israel and Mexico. So one more, and Korea will be at the ranks of Israel and Mexico. And the fact that this was back-to-back with the same head of state, we haven't seen that since November 1945, when Prime Minister Clement Attlee addressed the joint session after Prime Minister Winston Churchill did in May of 1943. So today we've invited 3 leading experts from Washington, D.C. and Denver, and to give their assessment of the last few days. And these 3 gentlemen really need no introduction. I think all of you know them very, very well. But I want to just quickly give short intros. First is Ambassador Chris Hill. He's currently the Dean of the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. We know him as the former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and as well as the former Ambassador to Korea. Next is Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, Victor Cha, Korea Chair at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. First of all, I want to start off today's discussion by just really opening it broadly and asking our 3 panelists here. You know, all 3 of you have watched a lot of U.S.-Korea summits in your careers. Was there anything in particular that stood out for you in the last few days? Let's start with you, Chris.
Well, first of all, before I answer your question, I would like to say what a pleasure it is to see Don Manzullo here as the new head of KEI. Don, when I was Assistant Secretary, I did often pop into Don's office, I admit to doing that. But what I really liked was there was a real effort by Don Manzullo to work across the aisle to develop kind of consensus positions, to work directly with us. In fact, he came over to the East Asia Bureau and met a lot of the desk officers, the people who do the real work. Sure. I mean, it's not the assistant secretary, believe me. And so he got a sense of how we operate, and we certainly knew how he operated. So it's just a real pleasure to see Don here, and congratulations on this, and congratulations to KEI for the wisdom to have Don here. Let me say that I thought, this won't come as a big surprise to anybody, but I thought the atmospherics were really excellent at this summit. Given the trial by fire that this new Korean president has had in her opening months, it's really remarkable how sort of calm and tranquil she approaches this. And you see a kind of similarity to our own no drama Obama president. So I think there's a kind of nice kind of meeting of temperament, which I find very attractive about this relationship as we begin the 61st year. But even though the visit was in respect of this extraordinary 60-year alliance, and therefore the bilateral side was obviously very important, a lot of issues they talked about, but what I was very pleased to see was a real effort on her part to talk regionally, to talk about the fact that there are other countries in the region, and that what she wants to do with the ROK is to try to work with these other countries. And it was a real pleasure to me to see this discussion of the Northeast Asia Peace and Security Mechanism, an effort that those of us who worked on the six-party process, and I see Dr. Cha here, you have to admit you were part of that. But I remember we tried to have a working group of the Northeast Asia Peace and Security Mechanism, and everyone said nice things, and we got to the North Korean speaker, I think it was Lee Gun or someone like that, and he started by denouncing the U.S., and then he denounced the ROK, and then he denounced Japan. And, I was about to pick up the sports page at that point, but then he denounced the Chinese and the Russians as well, so he was 5 for 5. And it did sort of remind me of the fact that they're not quite with the program. And, but nor do they need to be with the program. What we need is to get countries like Japan and ROK to work together, ROK and China, and President Park has indicated she's going to China next. So I was kind of encouraged to hear this understanding of the need for greater regionalization in the region, because some of these tough problems, such as the maritime issues, the sovereignty question will not be resolved immediately. What they need are mechanisms to deal with that, but in the meantime, mechanisms to sort of move ahead in these relationships. And therefore, this focus she had in the context of a bilateral visit on multilateral structures, I thought was very healthy and indicative of a president who's not only looking at today's issues, but is looking at tomorrow's structures as well.
Scott?
Yeah.
All right, let me help you with that, Scott. I think you're good.
Okay, great. Thanks for the technical assistance.
I used to do that in 7th grade. I was the guy who did the projector. Yeah.
It's first of all, thanks to KEI for putting this on and for including me as part of the discussion. I just want to make 2 observations. One is that it's interesting to think about this summit actually going back compared to Kim Young-sam and President Clinton, because we've come such a long way in terms of having a harmonized view of how to deal with North Korea over the course of the past 2 decades. And I think it's important to try to put that into a longer-term perspective, because in fact, a lot of the issues that had bedeviled the U.S. and South Korea in terms of managing their respective approaches to North Korea really are completely absent, I think, at this stage. But the other observation that I would make is it's also interesting to compare just the joint vision statement from 2009 with this anniversary commemorative statement. And for me, what comes across is that even though everybody talked about how important the personal chemistry was between Lee Myung-bak and President Obama, and I think that Park Geun-hye and President Obama also showed good chemistry, this is really a relationship that has been institutionalized in, I think, a very deep and comprehensive way. And now we've got the FTA in the rearview mirror. And so there's a strong foundation from which to build. And I think that in commemorating the 60th anniversary of the alliance, that really has come through over the course of the past 2 days.
Victor?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with my colleagues. I think it was a very successful summit. I think that the 2 of the leaders hit it off quite well. When you staff one of these things, one of these summits, you always try to build in personal time where the 2 leaders can do some things together. I mean, I remember once we recommended that President Bush and President Lee Myung-bak take a stroll through Georgetown or something where they have personal time together. And because this was a short trip, there really wasn't that time. But they managed to find time, I understand. Even between pieces of meetings, they managed to find some time together where it was just one-on-one. Because as you can tell from her speech this morning and her speech at the chamber, her English is pretty good. I think it's gotten a lot better, actually. She must have been practicing after she got elected, but it's gotten a lot better. And so she can carry a conversation with President Obama without the need of an interpreter. And that sort of time, I think, is important. I think, as both Chris and Scott said, airtight on North Korea. I mean, not even a question on those sorts of issues. And I thought what was interesting about her speech, I went to her speech this morning at the joint session. What was interesting, first of all, it was a great speech. The atmosphere was fantastic. Quite a number of members showed up, many standing ovations. As she left, everybody wanted her to sign her speech and everything. So just overall, it was great. But what was interesting to me about her speech, getting to Chris's point about tying what is a Korea problem to the broader future vision of the region. At the end of her speech at the Congress, she said there were sort of three pillars to her vision for the future of the alliance. One was sort of resolution of the North Korean question through trust politique, and she mentioned unification several times in her speech. And the second was about what Chris just mentioned, the Asia paradox, right? The notion that we have economic interdependence Asia, but security problems. And that her solution to this was this broader East Asian community built on a Helsinki process. And then she tied that into Obama's pivot, right? And about how this would be an important piece of the Asia rebalance. So I think it was a well thought out, it was carefully thought out speech that really tried to tie two visions together. Both her vision for the Korean Peninsula, but also Obama's rebalance to Asia. So I thought it was very artfully done.
Great. Chris, let's turn back to you. As Victor mentioned, and I'm assuming all of you agree that U.S. and South Korea are on the same page in regards to North Korea. And some of the messaging that's been coming out is basically the U.S. and South Korea will not accept a nuclear North Korea, and they will not tolerate North Korean provocation, and yet they're open to dialogue. But the North Koreans' position is, of course, you must recognize us as a nuclear power. It seems like we're at an impasse.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here after this summit?
I think there is an impasse there. I don't belittle that problem, but I think it is important indeed. I think it's critical that we be very clear that we will not accept a nuclear North Korea. And the irony is some of our biggest hardliners are the ones inclined to say negotiation makes no sense. Why have we been talking to them? They have nuclear weapons. Why don't we just admit it? That kind of attitude is to say to the North Koreans, hang in there, and sooner or later we'll admit it officially. So I think it's very important to make clear, no, we're not going to accept a nuclear North Korea. And not to go over the subject or flog this issue as I've had in the past, but I think it's very important that if they are ever accepted as a nuclear state, I think it just makes a mockery of any international standards. So your point is, where do we go from here? And I think the answer is, if we can get into some kind of dialogue, and I think keeping that door open to dialogue is important, because I think there are some people, I'm not one of them, but there are some people who believe that this is all about dialogue. And I think if you shut the door on dialogue or make it too conditional, you will kind of create a situation where you start having people not happy with your approach. So I think keeping the door open is just the right thing to do. But I think it has to be, to the extent one can get going on something, it's going to have to be very small steps. There can be some approach within the Korean peninsula, north-south, that's somehow tied into 6 parties. I think it has to be very, very small, maybe start on some humanitarian issues. I think we need to recall that nuclear or not, there are people starving in North Korea. And I don't think it's in anyone's interest to see the starvation of that continue. But I think ultimately it's going to be very important for the Chinese to carry a very firm message that nuclear North Korea is not acceptable. Continue that message and show no wavering on that while we begin some small steps, which I would argue should be in the humanitarian.
You agree, Scott?
With regards to the prospects for,
Yeah,
no, I think they hit it just about right in terms of an approach, and really, I think the approach is predicated on the need for North Korea to make some adjustments. There is a window for Park Geun-hye to kind of take the lead with her Trust Politik initiative. And she has, frankly, more political space than I think exists here in Washington to engage in a useful discussion at this stage. So, no, I think that we're in a fairly good position. If I were in North Korea reading and following the summit, I would not be very happy with the result. And that probably means it was relatively successful.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think so. North Korea has been fairly quiet up until now. Even if they remain quiet for the next couple of months, I still don't think that's a real platform that you can dive into engagement yet, either here, certainly not here in Washington, and I don't think so in Seoul. She's made very clear from the beginning that humanitarian assistance is not a part of this, and she reiterated that point here several times in her public discussions, that she clearly delinks humanitarian from political and nuclear issues. So that may flow, right, in terms of these small steps. But I think it's going to be a while before we see any sort of longer-term engagement. On China, I think it was just fortuitous that this Bank of China news seemed to happen just as the two leaders were meeting. I was assured that that was well coordinated with the Chinese. Just joking, right? That wasn't well coordinated with the Chinese, but it's a pretty significant step, I think. I mean, was a foreign exchange bank, foreign trade bank in North Korea at a Bank of China. There's a lot of stuff that flows through there, so that's an important sort of choke point. And for the Chinese to take that step, I think is a good one. The other thing I thought the most interesting thing that she said about China in her whole trip was not what she said publicly, but what she said in the Washington Post this morning in her interview, where she talked about how she would want to work with the Chinese to try to persuade North Korea. But then the other half of it was interesting, where she said, and if we can't get the North Koreans to change, then I want to work with China on the bigger solution to the problem.
She also talked about material aspects.
Right, that's right.
Which had to do clearly with economic sanctions, and I think she basically said that.
Yeah, so. And so I don't know, Chris, that was about the most forward-leaning thing that I've heard as South Korean presidents. I mean, Lee Myung-bak may have said it privately, but she was very forward-leaning, I thought, and her, as you saw in the Post, that was verbatim, right? They did a question and answer verbatim. So
let's switch gears a little bit here and focus on some bilateral issues. I think one of the issues that I think a lot of Korea watchers were concerned about leading up to the summit was, of course, the 1-2-3 agreement, where we are on that. And Victor, I'm sure you've seen some of the wording on some wording that President Obama had said during his speech yesterday, as well as President Park. And I believe President Obama referenced that the U.S. and Korea would reach some type of balanced agreement, somewhere between to address the non-proliferation concern, and yet also to be able to address South Korea's commercial concerns about the nuclear future. And President Park also referenced achieving an agreement that is appropriate for the 21st century. I think that those were her words. You've talked about this in the past and wrote about it as well. What does a 21st century agreement look like?
Good question. I mean, they're going to have to figure it out. They have 2 years. They have 24 months to figure this out. I thought the language was, very diplomatic. It was clearly a not compromise. It was a language that was based on some sort of consensus, where not both sides could claim that they got what they wanted out of it, out of that one sentence. She made a very hard push for it in the Congress this morning. Clearly sectioned it off as one issue. And so she was very interested and I think they're going to push very hard. The Koreans are going to push very hard on this. You know, I think that the 2-year extension was the right thing to do. They were clearly not going to reach an agreement. It was good to do it a couple of weeks ago, so it wasn't attached to the summit as a possible failure of the summit. But it's going to be a tough negotiation. Right. There's only one negotiation that's going to be tougher. I'm sure we'll talk about that. Yeah. But this is going to be a tough bilateral negotiation.
I agree. It's going to be very tough, but I think to talk about a 21st century agreement is to kind of lay down the position that the ROK needs to be treated in a way that's commensurate with its industrial status. And I've said before, I mean, there are every stage of economic development for South Korea has been met with people who say, oh, they can't do it, they can't export cars, they can't export ships, and so even though some of the commercial nuclear plans may seem very ambitious, you know, people who've bet against Korea in the past have been quite wrong, and so I think it's going to be tough to tell the Koreans, no, you're never going to be achieving those kind of levels, and by the way, we're also going to keep restrictions on you. So I think that has to be addressed. I completely share Victor's view. It's going to be a very tough one, but in a way, unfortunately, it's going to be regarded as a litmus test as to whether we have a 21st century agreement or not.
Oh. On the way from the U.S. Chamber luncheon, I was sitting with Chris Nelson here and Scott and Don, and we said, you know, the last few days there was one acronym that strangely was missing from all the discussion these last few days, and that was TPP. And Scott, you know, of course, FTA has been implemented for 1 year now, and President Park has brought the chaebols and the SME heads with her, and really trying to promote U.S.-Korea trade, economic relations, and now take full advantage of the FTA. And of course, next in the agenda is TPP. What's your sense? Where do you think U.S.-Korea economic relations goes from here?
Well, as you know, I'm not necessarily an economic trade specialist, but it's very clear that the strong business delegation from South Korea was designed to send a message. And I think the first message was actually related to the idea that South Korea is a safe place to do business and make money regardless of what North Korea is doing. And so, you know, this, I think, delegation shows a vote of confidence. But there's something else that happened at the Chamber of Commerce lunch that I thought was particularly interesting. And that is that we had a representative from labor who was invited not on the program to speak to this group of business people, right? And clearly that was also designed to send a different kind of vote of confidence and to send a message, I think, to South Korea domestically that this administration under Park Geun-hye expects labor and management to work together. And that, in fact, that is one of the critical things that she needs at this stage in order to keep the Korean economy moving. So I just thought that was very interesting. With regard to TPP, you know, the dynamic has changed, I think, with Japan's decision to enter, where 6 months ago, administration officials seemed to be signaling that they really wanted Korea to get in as a way of putting pressure on Japan, to a situation now where I think as time goes on, Korea is going to be on the outside and has to really determine whether it wants to join. And I don't know whether that discussion occurred very much at this particular stage, you know, in these meetings. But it's really, I think, much more a decision that is going to be determined by South Korea. The risk is, I think there's a possible misperception on the South Korean side. Because of Chorus as the entry point to get into TPP, they may perceive that they've done everything they need to do. But TPP is touted as the next generation. And so I think the big challenge is whether when South Korea decides it's ready to knock on the door, that they may find they have some other things that they need to do. They ought to start to focus on that at an early stage rather than being caught by surprise.
I thought it was, well, a couple of things. I thought it was interesting that she did bring such a large delegation of business folks. And I think clearly one of the messages, I mean, it's a celebration of course, but the other message was, I just want to show you that North Korea and what they do is not going to stop us from all the things that we do, which is a little bit of a different message from previous presidents. Previous presidents were always like, we're going to stand strong against this North Korea problem, full stop. And she kind of went beyond that and said, we're not going to let this stand in the way of a 21st century alliance, all these other sorts of things, which I thought was a nice twist. The other thing I understand is that, so she did a meeting with the business delegation here in the United States, which I thought was interesting, to use a trip like this when she has these 50 business leaders, and then to do a breakfast for them here, as opposed to doing something like that in Seoul, which I thought was interesting. And then on TPP, I think there's sort of my understanding is there's sort of two issues here. One thing that's making them much more interested in TPP now is, of course, the fact that Japan's in it. But at the same time, they're very interested in the FTA with China. And I think they've sort of come to some realization that actually playing on TPP may actually help them in terms of their negotiations with China. It gives them more leverage vis-a-vis China. The other thing is, I think, so that's positive. The negative side is, I think they're looking very carefully at the U.S. negotiations in TPP and how they deal with certain issues. And in a sense, they're sort of putting American feet to the fire because they would like to see U.S. performance on some of these issues before they commit, right? And a lot of these have to do with Japan. Sure. And how Japan is treated. So, this is sort of the next step in South Korea's dance with TPP. It's going to be interesting to watch.
And from what I understand, the decision to bring a large business delegation, in fact, the execution of it, I mean, these were invitations that people couldn't refuse. And I think it was to do a couple of things, just demonstrate the great industrial strength of Korea. But I agree with Victor. It was also an understanding that when Americans think of South Korea, they immediately think of North Korea. They don't necessarily think of industrial might and other issues. So I think it was part of an effort, too, to get people to think again about South Korea as not just being an issue, North Korean crisis. So I think that was very key. But I mean, it was not only the size of that delegation. I mean, she had the absolute top people in that delegation. It was impressive indeed. And I think for all the points that Scott and Victor made, I think it really shows a country that understands it needs to get to that next level. And so you do it with that kind of real show of force, really, show of industrial force.
Before I open up the questioning to the audience, I want to ask you one final question to all of you. Looking ahead, of course, this is her first trip as president is to the United States. Next is China, to Beijing. Of course, China is a growing force in the region. Now, how do you see, what does she need to do? How does she balance between the relationship between the United States and China as China becomes an increasing force? Chris?
I don't expect her ever to say at any point that the ROK should be the balancer. I think we've been there and done that. I don't think that's what's emerging. But I do think what could be emerging, and I think Victor made a very important point when he mentioned unification. And I think the key element in, if North Korea simply can never do the right thing, and there's a lot of evidence for North Korea not doing the right thing. I mean, they do all the wrong things, and then they still don't do the right thing. So it may be that there is a growing sort of sense that maybe this won't work out with the North Koreans. Maybe someday, who knows how, who knows when, there'll be some kind of North Korean implosion. and that somehow we'll all wake up one day, depending on what time zone we're in, and realize we've got a completely different political situation on the Korean Peninsula. And in the context of that completely different political situation on the Korean Peninsula, there is no relationship more important than the ROK-Chinese relationship. And so I think, to some extent, her going to China, her effort to work out with a Chinese leadership that, after all, for all the talk in this country about how authoritarian China is, I mean, we have a Chinese president who tends to have fewer powers than the ROK president or the U.S. president. So it requires a lot of effort. And I think she understands that. And so I think my sense is there's going to be a much bigger effort by the ROK to engage with China, such that if something happens, that as I said, we won't predict how, we won't predict when, but if something happens in North Korea, I think we'll see a much stronger ROK-China relationship, which will be necessary if those political arrangements shift.
Well, yeah, Chris has been very comprehensive. I'll just say that I think the right word is harmonize, not balance. I think that's what she's going for, is to try to bring the U.S. and China more close to being on the same page, both in terms of strategy and tactics, as everybody faces the shared challenge of dealing with North Korea.
I think her center of gravity very clearly is the alliance. I think that she messaged that very clearly during this trip. I think that's part of her DNA. The alliance is the core. And it's from that basis that she can try to reach out to China with trust, because trust politic is not just North Korea. It's with China also. And I think that'll be reciprocated on the Chinese side, because the Chinese are clearly infatuated with her. The whole Park Geun-hye thing and the daughter and all this, they're clearly quite infatuated with her, and I think her trip there is going to be a huge success. But I think she made very clear again in that post piece that her conversation with China on North Korea goes in two directions. One direction is, how do we bring them back to the talks and get back to a negotiation, back to the six-party agreements. But there's another direction too, which is if we cannot do this, then we have to start thinking about this other thing, which and maybe she did it on purpose. I think she clearly signaled that on this trip through her interview and through the number of times she mentioned reunification last night at dinner, as well as in the speech this morning and at the lunch today. I mean, she's really kind of setting herself up for this conversation with the Chinese.
Great. So I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask a few questions. If you can stand up, identify yourself, and then we'll go from there. So how about you, Chris? Chris, and then right there. Let's take.
Get the first question. Thanks very much, Chris Nelson report, and thanks for sharing the cab. I owe you one on that one. In addition to the TPP, which is a business trade type, we're all hoping, were there things that you were expecting to hear in public that you didn't hear, and do we have any indication that they may have been talked about a little more frankly in private? I'm referring, of course, to something that she did say in the Washington Post interview that they ran, concerns about both Japan and China on the history issue, but also something about olive branch, saying, we all have history issues. But I'm wondering if you've heard anything about what the private discussions might have been and other things that you were expecting to hear that you didn't hear. Thanks.
Let's take two questions. So the lady right here in the blue. Peter will do it. Peter. I got it. Peter will do it.
Thank you. Bing Wang with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. My question is, do you think it's really necessary for the U.S. to keep intense military exercise with South Korea, especially sending the aircraft to Northeast Asia, given the fact North Korea seems to have removed the missile from the platform? Thank you.
Okay, great. Did Japan issue private discussions?
The private discussion, I would assume yes, that they did have a private discussion on Japan, and in no small part because I think from the U.S. side, coordination and cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo is a very important part of how we deal with the North Korea threat. And I would imagine, quite frankly, that there was probably disappointment expressed on both sides at the fact that these historical issues are really starting to rise up and become a real impediment to cooperation, as well as concerns about what's going to happen with regard to these history issues as we get to the summer and early fall. I think Chris was saying earlier that she has more room to maneuver on North Korea than perhaps President Obama does. Well, I don't think she has any room to maneuver on these historical issues, especially things like the Kono statement. And so we heard a more positive sound coming out of Japan today on Kono apology, but that still leaves Yasukuni and all these other things that could really throw a wrench into the situation. And I thought her response again in the Washington Post was it sounded to me like a very genuine and frank response, which is she's disappointed that, whatever she said 6 years ago, the exact same problem the last time she was here.
Yeah, I think we actually heard less about the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative than I was kind of expecting in the run-up to the summit. And I think that one reason for this is related to exactly what Victor was just talking about, and that is that in relations with North Korea and Japan, that whole concept requires acts of statesmanship by the other side. And so she's in a very strange position because she's really dependent on the actions of others for that vision to be achievable. And then I thought the other thing, I hate to return to this, but I thought it was very interesting and significant the way that she phrased the discussion of the need for a modernized nuclear cooperation agreement at the Congress. Because this means that essentially she is registering her ask at a political level on the record in ways that I think may end up having some kind of it puts it into a different perspective in terms of how you manage the negotiation process going forward.
Well, again, I think that her public emphasis on this kind of regionalism is a reflection of some of the difficulties that they've had, the realization that not all these issues can be handled bilaterally, and I think it's kind of visionary. Refreshing to see this expressed, because I think too often in Northeast Asia there is this notion that somehow regionalism or regional approach is somehow at odds with bilateral approach. That is, the more regionalism you do, the less committed you are to bilateral relations. And I don't see that as a zero-sum game. She does either. But I noticed Victor and Scott did not answer the question about U.S. exercises. I am absolutely convinced that we need more, not less. If we had had those exercises in the spring of 1950, we wouldn't have had the Korean War. And I think it would really be problematic if we were to be seen as scaling these things down, because our gesture would appear to people in North Korea as somehow weakness. And I think it's very, very important that they understand that, if anything, their behavior in the last 2 months has caused a tightening up, an intensification of the ROK-US alliance. So I think it's very important that, if you're going to scale anything down for some technical reasons, let's say, and there may be issues there, you need to be very careful you're not sending the wrong signals to the North Koreans. They've misread signals before. And as for the fact that the North Koreans don't like these exercises and every year object to them, I think they know what can be done, and that is to get serious once again on the September joint statement, where we put everything on the table. Cross-recognition, everything was put out there, and they took a look at it, they kind of played with it a little, and they walked away. So I think they need to understand that we are never going to weaken these exercises, because they are part and parcel of the plan to defend the ROK.
Next set of questions, right here.
Hi, Tim Savage, Department of State. Over the last couple of years of the Lee Myung-bak administration, there was a lot of emphasis on U.S.-Korean cooperation beyond the peninsula and things like development aid, energy, green growth. I'm wondering if, how much do you see this continuing under the Park Geun-hye administration?
Well, I think she really, she certainly featured it in her public speeches. Talked a great deal about development assistance. I mean, granted, it was part of the narrative of the evolution of Korea under 60 years of an alliance framework, but I don't sense any dropping off of that. And in fact, she mentioned something about there's a new agreement that's just been signed or going to be signed. You had the global health stuff, but there's apparently some new stuff that's coming down the track. So I was kind of worried too that some of that might drop off after Lee Myung-bak, but I don't get the sense that it is. I think, again, she sees it as part of, I think her vision is she sees Korea as an important and significant public goods provider in the international system. Right? It was a receiver, but now it's going to be a provider. It's been a provider, and it will be an even more important provider. That's part of her vision, and I think I think she's going to follow through on that.
I guess one question is she going to use this kind of global Korea platform,
Right.
Which I think sometimes has more resonance with us than it does back
home.
Back home. So I think some of the branding may switch from the Lee Myung-bak period, but it was, that speech last night where she highlighted the role of the Peace Corps. As a former Peace Corps volunteer, I was so moved when she said, these young Americans, they fanned out among the villages, the hills, the mountains of Korea, et cetera. It was, and then brought up Ambassador Kathy Stevens to emphasize that. It was a very, very nice point. Yeah.
And then she said that Korea was the second largest, right? The second largest
Yes.
Contributor of relief and aid workers around the world today, only to the United States. And a lot of the folks I saw around the tables around me were like, "Oh gosh, I didn't know that."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on development cooperation, I think that is basically right. But I do think that there was a difference in emphasis. Actually, it was President Obama who was touting South Korea's global contributions in the joint press conference. And so I do think that in the course of this transition, the substance may not change so much, but certainly the branding is a little bit different. And so the other aspect, which is a small detail, but green growth is gone from the joint vision statement to be replaced by clean energy. Maybe this is just a good example of how every South Korean president has to have her own stamp. Rather than using the terms of the predecessor, but I have to note that that's the case.
Yeah, that never happens here.
And the fact that this wasn't usually what happens with new administrations is they kind of toss out everything with the baby with the bathwater and they try to start it up new. But the fact that she's taking things from the previous.
Her vision is really much more regional focused, though, than President Lee's. And so, these are the hard issues. Actually, I think that global Korea was popular in part because the region was so hard to deal with. But that doesn't mean that a Korean president has an option not to deal with it. And so I think Chris has very ably articulated why that sort of vision is so refreshing.
Any more questions? Please, right here.
Tim Shorrock. I've been writing about Korea for a long time, lately for Salon. I'm going to get back to what you talked about before in terms of the U.S., the position on North Korea and are negotiating whether we're going to talk to them or not. It seems that we're, the North Koreans say they would like to have an end to the sanctions before there's talks. They say, they've been talking about a peace agreement for a long time, for years actually. And we say you have to give up all your nuclearization. We're not going to talk to you until you end your nuclear program. They're saying we're a de facto nuclear power, and we have it in our Constitution now that we're a nuclear power. So I didn't hear anything from President Obama new from this administration about reaching out to North Korea in any kind of way, except President Obama used the word deterrence about 6 times when he spoke with President Park yesterday, and talked about military and talked about, he did mention our nuclear deterrence, our nuclear forces are part of the, weapons we would use to contain North Korea. So, is this realistic? I mean, we're stuck in a situation where they're making demands that they'll talk on these certain conditions. We say you have to give up everything before we talk to you.
We didn't say you have to give up.
Well, we
everything.
said nuclearization, right? They're saying they are nuclear. I don't want to argue with you. I'm just saying, just throwing it out there.
No, but if I could just
please.
briefly, the September 19th, 2005 commitment is simply that they will abandon all their nuclear programs. We didn't say you abandon them now. We've said you will, they need to reaffirm the commitments already made to abandon their nuclear programs. And so if they, for example, understand that they have made commitments, then we sit down and figure what the sequencing is of all this. That's a doable proposition. But if they say, no, we're not going to abandon any nuclear weapons, we weren't serious when we agreed to that, but we're willing to talk to you on the basis of being a nuclear power that will retain its nuclear weapons for the rest of time, I don't see why we should give in to that. I mean, it just makes a mockery of having any discussions with them. I mean, after all, we spent a lot of time getting them to agree, and they agreed to abandon their nuclear weapons. So that's been the issue. And what is the price for, what's the sequence of economic and energy assistance, of cross recognition, of a treaty on the Korean Peninsula, all those things. We're prepared, absolutely. They're all on the table. And we affirm that they're on the table, but they need to affirm that what they've done is also on the table. So to ask us to agree to what we've done and then to accept no responsibility for what they've already agreed is not a serious proposition.
In January of 2009, the North Koreans basically moved the goalposts. They changed to a normalization first, denuclearization maybe later position from the action for action position that Chris had been trying to negotiate through implementation of the joint statement. So I think all the Obama administration has been saying is that first, North Korea has to come back to the original framework represented by the joint statement. And that's obviously where the North Koreans are having trouble. They are putting forward a different framework that's actually just, I think, beyond the bottom line of what the U.S. is going to be able or willing to accept.
I mean, they've kind of painted themselves into a corner, and a lot of times when that situation happens, there's no way out. You just have to wait for the paint to dry, and so they may indeed just have to wait for a while until people forget some of these subsequent statements and then move on with it. But I don't see how we can kind of come back to them and say, okay, forget what you promised before. We'll just talk to you anew because talk is good.
Sure, please.
I think we need to remember Danny Russell's briefing of, seems like a year ago, but it was like Tuesday maybe? Sorry, Chris Nelson again. The Senior Director for Asia, Danny Russell, gave a briefing that was open, not classified, you can actually use his name on Tuesday, that talked about what needs to be done with North Korea as a process. And I think this sort of goes to what you were asking, that he wasn't changing the principle, he wasn't changing the end point, he wasn't changing any of the stuff that Chris has just said, but he was indicating in a sense, in response to the Park initiative about other things, that we understand talking to these guys is a process. So it seemed to be saying, we're not just saying we won't talk about anything except exactly that. It was a little more elbow room to it.
Please. Well, it's probably the final question. Please. Right next to you. right next to you.
Oh, thank you. Steve Goldberg at Oregon. I'd like to return to the nuclear cooperation agreement, if I could. There are a couple of issues that I'd like to raise and see what opinions you have. One is the issue of retransfer, which Japan has those rights through its agreements. Whether whether the ROK would eventually get that type of agreement with the U.S. And the second issue is, are there metrics between now and 2 years from now that you could look toward that would give some confidence that that there is movement and coalescence between the U.S. and the ROK on the nuclear cooperation agreement?
I'm looking to my nuclear scientist here on the left, Scott.
I'm not sure I know enough on the details with regard to the retransfer question. That's a very, that's not something that I've had, an occasion to look at. But, there's basically, I think, a gap over South Korea's desire for advanced consent and the U.S. unwillingness to offer advanced consent. And the metric will be whether or not we have an agreement within 2 years, or possibly whether we find ourselves needing even more time to try to conclude a mutually acceptable agreement. So what the extension shows to me is actually that neither side can afford to live without an agreement.
Yeah, I agree with that. The extension was, I think the extension obviously had to do with, in the near term, the optics of the summit and the fact that they were not near any sort of agreement, but also to try to create some stability in the markets and in the private sector. And so when you look at this 2-year time frame, it's actually not that much time. If you think about the process for Congress and everything else, it's not that much time. And so I think a lot of it will depend on how quickly these two negotiating teams get back together and start hashing some of this stuff through. But, and I know we're at the end, so let me just make one other point, which is that the other negotiation that I think will be as important and as political will be the burden sharing negotiation, special measures agreement negotiation. Given our sequester here and the politics of that in Korea, that's going to be a very big negotiation. And to me, it was very interesting that in the last night in the VIP reception, that one of the folks that come out of that was Eric John, who's going to be the new negotiator for this sort of stuff. So obviously, it's going to be I think a sort of a top priority issue, and it may actually take the headlines away from the 1, 2, 3 agreement, which would be a good thing for the negotiators if they could operate outside of the headlines on that negotiation.
As I started this program, these gentlemen had less than 24 hours to really digest what's been going on the last few days.
24 minutes. What do you mean 24 hours?
So this is really the raw expression of how they felt about the last few days. So please join me in thanking them for their insights today. Thank you.